Komunizmus vymyslel Žid Marx. Zachrániť nás môže iba jeden človek, súdruh Stalin. Jeho by sme tak na 2 dni potrebovali. Vystrieľal by všetkých a potom nech si ide ľahnúť naspäť. Chvála ti, Hospodine, všetkých svätým sa pokloním. Stalinské suky, na rukách vám ešte ani nevysla krv a cárskú rodinu zabíjali. Nezľutovali ste sa ani nad deťmi. Bez veľkého Stalina neurobíš ani veľké Rusko. Ľuďom zasrali mozog. Ja som jednoduchý človek. Stalin jednoduchých ľudí nechal na pokoji. V našej rodine nikto neutrpel. Všetci boli robotníci. Padali hlavy, vedúcich, ale jednoduchý človek si žil pokojne. Červená KGBácka svoloč. Čo skoro začnete ešte rozprávať, že žiadne tábory neboli. Teda okrem pionierských. Môj dedo bol domovník. A môj zememerač. Môj rušňovodič. Pri bieloruskej stanici v Moskve sa začal míting. Dáv burácal. Raz potleskami, raz výkrikmi. Zvrhneme krvavý, zločinný režim. Potom niektorí...
Morava. And when the Second World War started, he was 6 years old. He saw world, full trains transporting people like cattle to hell, and many other terrible moments. And then we won, he said, and the fields burned were suddenly flowering. Streets changed their names, people danced, drank, but also cried because of happiness, sorrow for those who stayed alive, for those who died. And then he said, and now go and live. And so he went and lived. There is a swimming pool, which is today a garbage heap, and he met there a girl with brown hair and wonderful name he never heard before. They have built a house close to a factory producing guns in the past. They built it with their own hands and effort, and they have spent 60 years living together. In March 2017, my grandfather died. Until then, I believed that it's us people who choose their own story, but I've understood that it's not true. It is the stories who travel the country like shadows, standing and hiking at in the streets, trying to find someone who will give them shape and to tell the story. And thus, the story of my grandfather has become my own story. Svetlana Alexievich knows her stories. She is rooting in them, and the stories root in her. She is losing her own body, ego, in favor of those who are forgotten. In the solar system of public history and private tragedies, those who live, were not born, survived, etc. She gives them her eyes, hands, and lips so that they can see, feel, and talk, so that she can talk, tell their story, how they lived, who they loved, what they dreamt, what they lost, what they will never forget, and what they will never again remember. Their words, gestures, silence have become her words, her gestures, her silence. When they cry, she cries with them. When they love, she loves. When they smell blood from other people, she smells the same. When they are dying, she's also dying. Like a person captured in a mirror, she copies our movements and feelings with such a painful accuracy that we, in the end, are unable to say who is in front of the mirror and who is behind the mirror. Svetlana Alexievich is landscape, a seashore, a border, border in flame of the eastern forest, the last movement of the heart, hurt hands who take out bones of Brussels houses, ruins, pubs. She arranged them piece by piece, gives bodies, faces, names to those people. Svetlana Alexievich is, first of all, a human being, full with empathy, understanding, and humaneness. She maps the stories of thousands, of hundreds of marginalized, silenced, lost people, and her work is transboundary. What she writes gets out of the white paper and is a whispering to us. It's an oral history of ghosts who lived with us. However, on the other bank of the river, she is arranging stories, photos, so that somewhere in reality they would become our photographs, our memories, our stories.
In the world in which there are no borders between the past and the present, between life and death, between them and us, there is only one blind map of the mankind on which we are learning again and again not to forget, because we are not only what we have lost, but we are also what we are still to find. Thank you. Thank you very much to Peter Barkov for his laudatio. I believe that not only us, we are going to find something here, but also our distinguished guest is going to find something here, hopefully. I invited editor-in-chief of the SME Daily, Ms. Balogova, and also I would like to invite her to hand over this great prize to Svetlana, and I believe that it is going to be very symptomatic.
International importance of this prize, I will speak in English. The Honorary Central European is a prize that's a form of appreciation to people who have strongly contributed to our culture, to our Central European identity, and to our historical memory. This is an appreciation of people who inspire the best in us, the best of our Central Europeanness. This is an appreciation of people who helps us to understand what are the values that we need to protect in order to be able to pass it on to the next generations. We hope that this prize becomes a tradition and that we will get new people who will enrich the family of Central Europeans. The recipient's work will actually remind us what makes us really Central Europeans. Svetlana Alexievich gives voice to the voiceless, and this is something that a lot of journalists feel as a strong inspiration because they would like to do the same. She helps to learn lessons of history with her incredibly deep humanity. She reminds us that the powerful actually can evoke a lot of suffering and a lot of pain in people, but they cannot take away their dignity and their hope. This is also something that we need to learn in order to protect the dignity of the voiceless in the society. She reminds us that ideologies can also cause a lot of suffering. And we need to understand how to actually protect our dignity even when the ideology turns against us, and how to be generous to each other. Ja som veľmi šťastná, že Svetlana Alexievich je prvou laureát.
I'm very happy that Svetlana is the first laureate of our award, which is granted not only on behalf of the Daily SME, but also on behalf of all the journalists, all the editors' offices, because they also tried, just as Svetlana, to tell the stories on days off. They want to show us the direction which we should take in order to preserve the true value of Central Europe. Thank you.
Dobrý večer.
Good evening. I'm very happy that on behalf of the Central European Foundation, 10 years after the Central European Forum was established, we can take part in this very significant event. This is really a special evening, and let me say on behalf of the Foundation that we are happy that we helped publishing 3 books by Ms. Svetlana Alexievich, published by Slovak publishing houses. We consider it important and also necessary to create a space where people can freely, openly communicate with one another, exchange their opinions, their experiences. And it is the way of how to enable people raise their voice. This is sometimes not so common, and it may be quite rare. And she is an admirable. She brings an admirable knowledge of different faiths of people. She conveys the knowledge of many countries, and we are really happy that we can hear these voices here tonight.
Takže teraz už nasleduje ozajstná diskusia.
And now it is time for a discussion. And during the discussion, or after the ladies have spoken, you will also have a chance to ask your questions. I just want to take a few minutes to thank all members of the jury for this award, but I never accept such awards with the feeling that they are just for me, because they are also intended for people who are not amongst us anymore and whose voices I have conveyed. Thank you once again.
French, and I understand Russian, but I speak it not very well, so I decided I would speak in English. And I feel extremely privileged to be sitting on this stage next to an author that I admire and I have admired for many years. And what we will do is we will have a 15-minute discussion with Svetlana Alexievich, and then 15 minutes which I would like to use for you, for the questions from the room. So if there's any question you want to ask her, this is your chance, and please, come into the conversation with us. Svetlana, you are a collector of voices. You have collected thousands of tapes of people talking to you, telling you their stories. And now, for a few minutes, we're going to be listening to your voice, and we'll be asking you questions. And I know that often you prefer to listen rather than to have to answer questions, but I'm hoping that you will open up and give us your thoughts. And because this is the Central European Forum, and because we are in Bratislava, and you are not only somebody who helps us see history and how people experience history at a personal level, it's the wonderful effect of your literature is to help us see inside human beings who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. You help us see history, you help us see people in history, but you are also a voice for those who aspire to freedom, aspire to democratic values, and who fight for them. And there are many fights like this. Many people are mobilizing in different countries, but in this country, and I wanted to ask you about this country, you being in Bratislava, I know you visited today the memorial to Jan Kuciak, and I wanted to ask you how you relate to those in this part of Europe, in Central Europe, who are fighting for certain rights, freedom of expression, freedom of information, who come out on the squares like yesterday and who are mobilizing. How do you, with your experience and the part of Europe that you come from, where the political situation is, of course, in Belarus, what we know, but how do you see this fight here for values, and in the case of Jan Kuciak, who you paid homage to today? Oh, the microphone. Sorry.
У меня же свой есть, да.
Да.
I would like to say that in the 90s, which is not so far away, we shouted one word that was freedom, but we even didn't realize what freedom means. What is it? We haven't realized that it's not such a festive day as we've believed. We didn't know that whether we will see the beautiful face of freedom when the communists leave. But it was a very difficult period, and the way to freedom is a long way, and very often it's also a bloody way. And the way where the elite, political or creative, gave up new ideas, new purposes, new meaning, is a new situation after the socialist period, which means the way to social democracy. And basically, we don't know where to. And these people, our saints of today, and I have in mind these two beautiful young people at a time of their great love. And their death is a reminder that freedom is a very expensive thing, and we didn't believe that it is so.
In 2015, you made several speeches, and I listened to your speech again earlier today, and you said something which is similar to what you said just earlier. You said that this wasn't a prize for you. This was a prize for many people. And in Russian, you said, this was in Stockholm, on the 11th of December 2015, you said that this prize, это как поклон многим.
That this prize is a bow to many people and Russian people and several generations who fought
to their suffering and their pain. And I wanted to ask you, do you think, with all the books that you've written, the voices that you've made emerge from the generations that suffered the Second World War, those who suffered from the Soviet Afghanistan War, and many other, those who suffered from the collapse of the Soviet Union and how they experienced this, do you think that the pain and the suffering that was experienced during this entire Soviet experiment is still something that people don't fully understand, even to this day?
Я думаю, что
I believe that the real question to which I was looking for answers all these 37 years, because at that time I needed to write all these books, the question is why our suffering is not transformed into a value, into freedom, why people who lived in slavery didn't die out, why we still have new slaves emerging. That's a question. What's happening? What's going on? And it's a question I have no answer to. The answer is somewhere deep in our mental history. Suffering, which is described by many Russian classical authors like Dostoevsky, have thought that suffering prepares people to resurrection and that they will be then better people. I don't know, but we see this vicious circle of suffering, and really I felt like in a dead-end street when seeing it, and sometimes I had feelings that I can't continue living, that I'm desperate, I don't see a way out, I don't know how to name it, what words to use in order to defend people against it. And I have often the feeling that words are in fact helpless. It's all so complicated, intricate. I don't have a specific relation to suffering, which we see in our culture. And I think that suffering deforms people. Shalamov, my beloved author, has described it very well. He said, a camp won't teach you anything, that it won't teach you anything to live or to learn. A camp is something nobody needs. And the most difficult was to extract the spirit and to put down a story, utopia of this lie of deceived people who, and we see how all this repeats itself. We see the new bragging young men who will continue to sit in pubs even in 100 years and That was my feeling when I traveled Russia. However, I believe, or I would like to believe, that the spirit which would heal us from this slavery, let's say in the starting stage, would bring us to a point where we could start to speak about freedom, because today the word freedom has no content and it brings only a kind of pseudo meaning, indicating that it should be something, could be something.
Countries like Belarus, a country like Russia to find some of the answers. What do you think is needed today? You are born in Ukraine, but you grew up in Belarus. Your mother was Ukrainian, and you said one day that when you look at Russia, you feel a bit confused. You know, are you part of this? Are you in a way Russian also? Are you? And you've written about the phenomenon of what you call the collective Putin in Russia, not just Putin himself, but the collective Putin. And my question is, when you've now come back to Belarus after 11 years in exile in Germany and France and other countries, what would you say after having come back to Belarus and watching, I'm sure, Russia and Ukraine very, very closely? What is missing for some of the burden of the past to be lifted and for these societies to move in the right direction? What is missing?
Вы знаете, хороший вопрос, потому что когда я последний...
It is a great question, because when after 11 years I last arrived in Minsk, in Belarus, the first year was incredibly difficult, because even Democrats or opposition members, friends who were visiting with me said things that made me really puzzled, and their opinions, their attitudes, their opinions of the values of human life, it was all strange to me. I believe that this was because we were growing up in a culture of violence, and we were so imbued by violence that this culture finds its impact in everyday life. And when people who have lived from the very beginning with such values, such attitudes, find it very difficult to change. I believe that it may be important to be ready for a long-term process. Maybe we will be able to achieve this within the lifespan of my generation, but I'm not sure. My granddaughter is 13 today, and I believe that their generation is also going to experience many problems in the years to come. Perestroika was meant to open up opportunities for great progress, but it became clear that we stifled these opportunities, and the current ruling class was pushing people towards the dark spheres and throwing them back to the past. And this is quite discouraging, especially when you hear it from young people. It is a fact that people sit in every one of us. This is a genetic accumulation of the past, and we can only hope that over time, gradually, things will change. There is no other way. We cannot expect that something will become or be. Okay.
There is a consolidation of civil society in Ukraine. Of course, the country is in a very difficult situation, but when you look at it from Belarus and knowing Ukraine very well, is there any way that Ukraine could be an inspiration for Belarus?
Вы знаете, это вот когда ты сидишь в Европе,
when a person lives in Europe and considers himself or herself to be a European intellectual, it is very difficult to speak about victory or even mini victory in Ukraine, but still it is an example, it is a model for many people. And when you talk to people in Belarus and you ask about Ukraine, people in Belarus say, oh, God forbid that similar things happen in Belarus as they did in Ukraine. We do not want to see any tire burning or guns being all over the place. In the last few elections, Lukashenko won, especially because people were scared, because Lukashenko made clear that people learn about Maidan in the most terrible terms. And people in Belarus aspire for not for bloody developments, but for solemn developments. This is part of the Russian culture. People are in mood for miracles. There is a fairy tale called Tsarevich. It was about a dumb young boy who was just idling at home, and everything was great. And they asked him why the Tsarin found a liking to him. That's just parts of Russian fairy tales. Unfortunately, our problems are deeply rooted in our culture. We do not have awareness of the value of human rights or of the virtues of personality. It is very difficult to listen to the news coming from Ukraine. Only a few people are ready to absorb this news. Although there is part of the young generation that is acquiring a better view of Maidan.
The audience with your questions. And my question is about your incredible literary method. You play with the boundary between, and I'm a journalist, and you play, it seems to me, with the boundary between reporting as very precise, astute, full of empathy reporting, the groundwork of a journalist, listening to people, and fiction, literary work, and you call this the chorus novel. You have called this at times the chorus novel, like a choral, like a chorus of voices. And when you look, as a journalist, I wanted to ask you this, but I know some other people in the audience were curious about this when I discussed the conversation I would have with you. When you look at journalism today, and you were once a journalist. You started as a young journalist in Minsk for a local agricultural. It was called Selskaya Gazeta or something. When you look at journalism today, what advice would you give so that journalists can be, as you know, the best listeners of people and the best transcribers of reality today, of what people actually experience? When you look at journalism, the way it's done, what advice would you give?
Ну, вы знаете,
What does it mean to listen to people in a good way? It is important to hear something new. And if you want to hear something new, you must learn to ask questions in a new way. To be able to do that, or in another way, a journalist should be a person who gives up banalities completely. Most people are people who are satisfied with banal issues in different forms, words, books. It's enough for them. But journalists shouldn't take this way. It would have a meaning only when the journalist tells something that hasn't been mentioned somewhere, wasn't given a name, it's hanging somewhere in the air, has no shape. And it's important to name it, to capture it, to tell it. That's the job of a journalist. But while running, you can't do that in a good way, in a solid way. I remember that I made once a risky move, and I stopped working, and I went to people, and I traveled to Russia. I lived really for cents, but it was important to get away from the work which forces you to run and run and run. It was important for me to have time for me in solitude, and I call my works the novels of life voices. Life today is a high-speed life, and you are unable to follow it in a slow way and a highly elaborated manner. That is my feeling. Other people may give you another answer, but I think the way I do it allows me to get there, to catch it, to hear it, to listen to it. And I think that we should start by saying that the world is a mysterious thing. A human being is an ununderstandable existence or individual, and it is important to strike a balance, and it's important to talk about complex issues. It's important to show that life is tragic, and maybe the future generations will think that we are living in a barbarian period, because nobody will then understand why people were murdering, killing, or dying in such a cheap way. for so little money, you must try to rise high and to keep the level so high. Since my childhood, I loved to listen to also simpler people, and I always found some surprises in them. They were people who would read Dostoevsky, but they understand a lot. And sometimes they understand more than all of us together.
Sure. Are there any questions? I'm sorry, I can't see very, yes, you have to raise your hand very high here, and we'll take 2 questions to start with, the young man there, and then behind him, we'll take 2 questions.
Mrs. Alexievich, you traveled long distances, but how did you find all those people? By which method?
Could you say who you are? Or
I'm a graphic designer, and I read 5 of your books, and I'm asking, how did you find all those people?
Okay, good question, and we'll take another question just behind you. There was another hand. Yes, thank you.
Вы знаете, найти мне героев было несложно.
It wasn't so difficult because when you open any door of any house, you will be simply astonished by what you hear. This suffering, the tragedy you have seen in the 70s years, and you still see it, and it comes from Syria and Ukraine and from everywhere. It seems complex, but it is also not so difficult, not so intricate. It was more difficult to find people who are willing to think in their own way, like women about war, so that they would abandon the masculine canon. Only very strong women could do it. People you could take out from, extract or take away from the masculine love to war. I've been to war areas, and I've seen that men love it. They love it when they can shoot from a gun machine. They see beauty in the war. In the night when the bullets are flying and the men are focused, so you can find a lot of beauty in it. And to force people to stop loving the god Mars, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to take this toy away from man. Therefore, I looked for those people to talk to who think, who deliberate. And sometimes when you approach a woman who speaks banal things, trivial things, and then she says, do you know how I had to walk the field where all the corpses were, and I had to check whether somebody among those is still not alive, because after me there will be another unit, and they will not take care of whether somebody might be still alive. They will just take them away on a truck, and that's it. And so I walk the field, and I see the corpses, hands up, legs I don't know where, watching in the, looking in the skies, and I see the faces, and I see what's behind the face. This shock, as if they had